Today is episode number 363. That means that, counting today, we're only 3 days away from our first anniversary of this podcast and the start of year 2. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast from the Weather Network in Canada. For today's episode, I will tell you the story of Canada's deadliest peacetime maritime disaster. Now, before you start asking questions, let me throw you a few knuckleballs here. This shipwreck didn't happen at sea. It was also not even on the sometimes deadly waters of the Great Lakes. And it also didn't even happen in stormy weather. All that you know going in is that it happened this day in weather history. May 29, 1914. The passenger ship, the Empress of Ireland, was traveling in the St. Lawrence River off Rimouski in the province of Quebec. However, at the same time and in the same waters was a Norwegian ship named the Storstad. They were traveling on respective courses that crossed paths, but in normal conditions, this is easily correctable. But these were not normal conditions. The weather was so calm that the fog that had developed was allowed to settle, and when it did, it acted as a blindfold to the ship's captains and pilots. This heavy fog rolled over the water, and the two ships lost each other in the dense coverage. Sadly, the next time that they would spot each other was when they had no time to avoid a collision. The Storstad accidentally rammed into the hull of the Empress and fatally wounded her. She would immediately list hard to one side, and that would immediately render half of the ship's lifeboats useless. With only 2 more episodes to go after today until the end of our first year, it is now more important than ever to remember that this day in weather history can be enjoyed a number of ways. Right now, you are listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there is also the daily podcast video short. They are shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, and oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. It took the Empress of Ireland only 14 minutes to sink. Why? What happened? The listing side of the ship dipped below the water level, and that exposed the portholes of the ship's cabins and quarters. Here is now a massive example of human error. Water proceeds to pour uncontrollably into the ship through those portholes because they were left open by guests and crew. Now, this obviously flies in the face of any and all maritime regulations. One would assume, however, that because this was 1914, there was not any real quality air circulation or conditioning on board. For that heavy of a fog to amass over an open body of water like the St. Lawrence, and remember off the top, we said it was near Rimouski, meaning it was probably closer to a shoreline. The shorelines freeze in the winter. Therefore, there was likely a much milder and perhaps even humid air mass that was now overriding these much cooler waters to create said fog bank. Plus, for the fog to settle like this, as I mentioned earlier as well, there likely was no breeze. So now, take all of that in, and one could likely conclude that it was so stifling out that they opened the windows. This, however, in this instance, resulted in the drowning of many passengers before lifeboats could even be launched from that one side of the ship. Add all of that up, and in total, they lost just over 1,000 of the total just under 1,500 on board, and of that, 840 were passengers who died in this tragedy, this day in weather history. So tomorrow is the second to last day of the first year of this podcast, and I will be telling you the story of how Oregon's second largest city vanished in a day. It's a true story, I kid you not. That's tomorrow on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.